called on his nephew, Andy Streifeld, who has done the documentary, and said, would it be possible for you to go and try to get an interview or some words or comments from Mr. Volcker that we might show at this event? So, ably supported by and aided by Chairman Volcker's assistant, Melanie Martha, who became an impromptu producer, Andy arranged a videographer to allow Mr. Volcker to record a message. It was recorded yesterday afternoon, edited last night, brought down today, so it is fresh, and we wish to share it with you, a message from Chairman Paul Volcker. During lunch, he sent a text with a photo of him sitting in front of the computer watching. So he's paying attention. To bring our afternoon to a close, we're blessed to have three amazing public servants. David Gergen has a legacy of public service that is as impressive and long-standing as anyone in our nation. He has served as a White House advisor to 4 United States presidents: President Nixon, Ford, Reagan, and Clinton. He has also had and continues to have a distinguished career in journalism and as a commentator in public affairs. He is currently a professor at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, where his role enables him to work with a rising generation of public service leaders. Congressman Barney served as a member of the United States House of Representatives from Massachusetts from 1981 to 2013. Count those years, 1981 to 2013. He served as chairman of the House Financial Services Committee and was a leading co-sponsor in 2010 of the Dodd-Frank Act, a sweeping reform of the United States financial industry. Secretary Jack Lew served as the 76th United States Secretary of Treasury, serving from 2013 through 2017. He also served as the 25th Chief of Staff in the White House from 2012 to 2013. Previous to those roles, Secretary Lew served as Director of the Office of Management and Budget in both the Clinton and Obama administrations. He is currently a visiting professor of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. Please join me in welcoming to the stage David Gergen, Congressman Barney Frank, and Secretary Jack Lew for what I'm certain will be an enlightening conversation. So what an honor and a pleasure to get to join the three of you here. I think you all know this, but earlier today we saw a video clip about Mr. Volcker and about his father, who was a city manager, and what respect he had for his father, but what respect he thought the people in the community had for public servants. I think he used the phrase when you and I, David, were talking to him about a conversation that we had hoped to have this afternoon with him. I think if I remember correctly, he said, "It seemed to me as a child that leading civil servants were gods." I don't know if they're quite at that level, but I think we all know that public servants are incredibly important and valuable. He was clearly influenced a lot by his father, and that led him into public service. My first question for each of you is, what leaders were your public service idols that caused you perhaps to follow the path of public service? Secretary Lew, let me start with you.
Well, it's great to be here and to be able to honor both the career that Paul Volcker has had and the work he's doing and you're all doing to promote public service and be part of the conversation. You know, I grew up in the 60s and the 70s. They were years when if you weren't paying attention to politics, you weren't paying attention to what was going on in the world around you. And I grew up in a home, my dad had started out in the Depression as a lawyer in the New York City Corporation Counsel's office. And my mom was politically active. And the dinner table conversation was, as a citizen, you have to take responsibility. And you know, for me, at the time, frankly, I was disillusioned with the leaders of our generation because things weren't going so well in the late 60s and early 70s. But it was a time when, notwithstanding the fact that you disagreed with what leaders were doing, at least I was brought up to respect the traditions that they came out of. Many of them had grown up in the tradition of the New Deal. You know, you could agree or disagree with Lyndon Johnson, but he came to Washington as part of the New Deal. You could agree or disagree with the war in Vietnam, but there were other things in domestic policy going on where you had to pay attention to the fact that whether it was civil rights or housing, you know, things were moving in the right direction. I was brought up in a home that did not think of Richard Nixon as the person you would want to emulate. But you had to pay attention to the fact that there was an environmental movement and clean air and water bills were passing. And you could disagree with people, but if you engaged with them, you could make a difference. You know, I took that to heart and kind of rolled up my sleeves pretty early and got on the field and stayed for a long time. You know, started as an intern, saw a lot of things on the Hill when I was very young that didn't appeal to me as what I wanted to do. But what you could do struck me as being the most profound influence you could have on your society. And obviously, I rose through the ranks in a sort of non-traditional way. And the people I emulated were the people who I had seen having the kinds of careers where by being the policy experts, by getting their hands around how do you run an organization, they were able to kind of break through some of the political noise and get things done. So there are a lot of people who kind of stood out to me to represent that. But, you know, kind of the one who was the end of a generation, well, two people who were the end of a generation. I worked for Speaker O'Neill for almost 8 years. His commitment to making the democratic process work, even when you had to lose, left an indelible mark on me that it's not just about winning and losing. It's about making democracy work. And somebody else who, from a very different background, made a huge impression on me was Bob Ball, who had been Social Security Commissioner under Nixon, under Democratic administrations. And his legacy was by caring as deeply as you possibly could and working harder than anyone else and earning the trust of people on both sides, you could actually bring people together on something as potentially toxic as dealing with Social Security in 1983. So those are the kinds of people who were role models to me in my professional life.
You've been role models to many, I can tell you. David?
Well, first of all, Tom, thank you. It's an honor to be here and to honor Paul Volcker in particular. I hope he's having a chance to listen in, or after 5 minutes or so, maybe he'll take a nap. But we all, I think, come here to pay homage to Paul and what he represents in this country. And I think it may well be that you and I have a couple of heroes in common, given your North Carolina roots and my North Carolina roots. I had the privilege, my dad was a professor at Duke, and I grew up starting to write for a newspaper, the Durham Morning Herald, Durham Sun, but I started out in sports, but I gradually worked over into first obituaries and then into local and state news. And I wound up with summer jobs with the beat for City Hall and walking the streets of Durham and talking to the county manager and talking to the person at City Hall and going down and looking at the police reports and that sort of thing. And it was very eye-opening and really helped me understand some of the inequalities that we saw in the South at that time. This was the late 50s when I was in the newspaper side. But the fellow who really brought me into public life was our governor, who was Terry Sanford. And he was elected in 1960. And it was interesting. I went to Joe Flashman's, like it was his 65th or 70th birthday, and there were 3 dozen of us there. And the question was, how many of you here got into public service because of Terry and Joel? And like half the room stood up.
Yep.
You know, because Terry Sanford was our Jack Kennedy in the South. He was progressive. He was taking on the fact we didn't have very good schools, that African Americans were at the back of the bus, so there were all these different things. And I worked for him. He started something called the North Carolina Good Neighbor Council, which was our race relations group. And it was just about the time that those 3 kids, Werner and company, got killed down in Mississippi. And we were trying to keep peace in North Carolina by forming biracial councils across the state. And I worked for a fellow named Dave Coltrane, who had been the budget director. And very segregationist most of his life, came from rural part of the state, and it completely changed his mind. And I drove him around state to form these councils. I was calling, driving Mr. Dave. And I worked for him for 3 different summers. I kept coming back, and it was, I must tell you, working on civil rights under Terry Sanford was the most satisfying portion of my public service throughout.
Well, thank you. Congressman?
I wish Paul, to whom I say hello, and I congratulate the wisdom of those who arranged it so he could listen and not respond. 'Cause I'm sure, Paul, you're sitting there busting to get in, but you can't do it, so you're going to have a little patience. But you've gotten your licks in and more, and will continue to. Paul is my current role model, and I wish more people took him there. One of the big problems we have today in America, perpetuated by people's ideology, by the negativism in the media, is that people have lost confidence in government. People are anti-government. I mean, I think that's why we have an increasing eagerness on the voters want to be satisfied by being made to feel good. But I think if James Carville was asked that famous question to which he answered, "It's the economy, stupid. You know, what's the key to the election?" He would say today, "It's the psyche, stupid. Go out there and make them feel good." And some of my friends who also believe in government have responded to that in a way that I think is self-defeating. They take a particular activity of government and talk about how good it is and how important it is, but either implicitly and sometimes explicitly say, it's unlike the rest of government. It's sort of, well, this is good, but you differentiate it from government. And what the great thing that Paul is doing, and I mean this genuinely, he's got this enormous, well-deserved reputation. He has become, for many Americans, the symbol of reform in the financial community. People who do not fully understand derivatives, which is almost everybody, including, for example, the people at AIG who were selling hundreds of billions of them, who clearly did not understand them, they know the Volcker rule. And I would have people stop me when on the street still, they're not going to get rid of that Volcker rule, are they, without knowing a great deal about what it is. But what Paul has done is to take that prestige that he has earned and put it at the service of government. So Paul doesn't say, hey, this is good, but sort of implicitly forget about the rest of the government. He enhances government. He's one of the best sort of pro-government people out here that we have today. As to, and it was government that got me involved. It was actually on the negative side. I was 14. I remember this in 1954. I remember being outraged reading about the death of Emmett Till, who was my age, 1954. He was 14, who was a black kid from Chicago who was brutalized because he looked at some woman wrong in Mississippi. And what was particularly outraging was that the federal government could do nothing because the South had managed to filibuster, so there was no federal involvement. I did have the satisfaction in 2009 of being there when we passed the federal hate crimes law expansion to cover people who hadn't been covered. And the other negative thing was Senator Joseph McCarthy. My father was what we called then, what we now call an early adopter. He was very technological, unlike me. And he bought a television set in 1940. And so I watched the Army McCarthy hearings. And that was a fascinating thing. But again, I got engaged because of things I wanted to change that were bad. And as I did, my models and the people I was attracted to, early, the first that I got to know, were people who seemed to me to combine, I'm a big free speech guy. I don't believe that hate speech should be outlawed. And I think I think there was a qualitative difference between saying and hitting. I'm a John Stuart Mill advocate there. But if I was going to ban something, I would make it a misdemeanor to use pragmatism and idealism as if they were opposites. Your ideals are of no value to anybody except making you feel good if you're not pragmatic about getting them implemented. So that's the people I was attracted to. And the first national figure who attracted me in 1954 was Hubert Humphrey, who had this reputation for being a zealot, but somebody who was effective in the United States Senate. And then as I got into college and later, another North Carolinian, actually I just spent the week at the Terry Sanford Institute 2 weeks ago with Joel Fleischman, but somebody who introduced me to Joel was Allard Lowenstein, one of the least known, most important figures in America, sort of really a guy who motivated and showed the way, again, a very pragmatic zealot, and moved on. And that's been, throughout my career, I've sort of tried to find people who did that. In fact, I would say to Bill, one of the people long since forgotten, it didn't end well, but there was a congressman from New Jersey, Frank Thompson, who was a He was a leader of the Democratic Study Group in the House. So that's been the kind of people who have motivated me. But I just want to go back again to Paul. He has done, yes, he's did an enormous service with us with regard to financial reform, but he's done a further service by insisting that people understand that what he did with the Volcker rule was an example of what government can do and why you need government.
Terrific. So one thing you all have a lot in common, but one of the things you have in common is that you've all interacted with Mr. Volcker at various times and in various ways. I think it'd be great if you'd talk just for a minute about your interactions with him, your assessment of him as a leader, as a public servant. If you got a good anecdote, love to hear that. So think about that. And again, Secretary Lew, if I could start with you.
So I have known Paul Volcker since he was chairman of the Fed, and I was a young man working for the Speaker of the House. And I must say, sitting in a meeting with the two of them, giants physically as well as in terms of what they'd accomplished, was somewhat humbling to an almost 30-year-old. And I was always impressed in those days that the courage of his convictions. You had to do hard things, and you weren't necessarily going to be popular, but if you believed it, you had to do it and explain it and have the courage of your convictions. That didn't change as he left the Fed and continued to engage on issues, whether it was the broad concern for public service or his engagement on financial reform. And through the years that I was Secretary of the Treasury, I spoke with him frequently at a broad range of issues because his interests, as you know, are eclectic. It's not as if you could pigeonhole him into, well, you talk to him about the Volcker rule, but you don't talk to him about other things. He had views on a lot of things, and they were sometimes iconoclastic. It was him saying, we're going to shoot for the stars here. You might not be able to deal with that now, but somebody's got to be talking about what's the right thing if you had complete freedom to do what you wanted. And I respect that about the arc of his career. It doesn't necessarily always make you the most popular person, but that's not the most important thing. Having the integrity of your views, being able to make the case and use, as Barney said, the credibility that you have to lend it to things that are of public purpose, those are really important attributes that I wish more people who were leaders in public life carried with them, both while they were in official positions and afterwards. I'll tell you one somewhat funny anecdote, and Paul doesn't remember this story, but I remember being at those meetings with the Speaker and the Chairman of the Fed, and they sometimes would order lunches for the 3 or 4 of us there. And I remember when it was a lunch that neither I or the other staff person at the meeting were eating, the two of them would lean over and say, "You're not eating that sandwich?" And they would have a second lunch, which was our lunch, and with no inhibition at all.
Well, when you're large physically like the two of them, you can see why. But, well, I'll tell you, he has not stopped reaching for the stars. We are inspired by that every day. So that's a great thing to point out about him.
In fairness to the rest of us,
Yeah, he doesn't have as far to go. Yeah. David?
Well, as I look back over the years, I guess one of my regrets is I haven't had a chance to spend more time with him. It's been sort of episodic, and I've always enjoyed and appreciated the times I have had because he is I think as Barney stated so well, he is a model public servant. And I think he stood for the right values and fought for them for a long, long time. I was actually in the Reagan White House when the question arose about his reappointment, his possible reappointment. And there was tension in that White House because he was first appointed by Jimmy Carter, I think all of you know. And it was a little bit like the Janet Yellen situation. And there were a lot of people around Reagan who thought, no, we ought to move to a Republican and this sort of thing. And there was a faction of us who said, he's been terrific. You ought to keep it. And Jim Baker led the fight inside to persuade the president to stick with him. And he asked me, and I think it was Richard Darman, together to come up with a report that would help to persuade the president to reappoint him. And I'm glad I participated in that. because it frankly, it wasn't that hard to sell for Reagan, but it was extremely important for the country. And he just those two back-to-back terms. I think if you look back, inflation had been raging in this country, and we were faced with high interest rates and high inflation, and it was people didn't recognize that the inflation was really hurting the poor more than anybody else, low-income people, because they saw their holdings disappear. And one of the things I would say about that is that it was the combination. Reagan came in and was faced with the question that Paul Volcker really wanted to break the back of inflation. And it was certain if you supported him, you were going to get a recession, and a very sharp recession. And you'll recall that unemployment went over 10%. And the president's ratings declined. We lost 27 seats in that first midterm election. And it was very tough on Reagan. But he decided to stick with it. He thought Paul Volcker represented what was best. He ought to stick with him, and he ought to stick with the policy. And he did at some considerable cost, political cost. But I look back upon that as actually one of the high points of bipartisan relationships in the executive branch that really made a difference. I think the two of them sticking together, we haven't had as serious an inflation problem since. And it really made a huge difference in the course of the country. So I look back upon that period with great fondness. And what I think brings us here today is that since leaving active public life or appointments, that he brought us this whole concern for the quiet crisis, as he called it several years ago. And now it seems to be, well, if anything, the crisis has gotten worse, and our reaction to it is even quieter. So that's one of the reasons I welcome this gathering today.
Thank you.
I don't remember it because, I don't remember the encounter. Obviously, I first met him because I was a member of what was then the Banking Committee in the House, now Committee on Financial Services. And we had jurisdiction over the Fed to the extent that Congress does, and we would have the semi-annual hearings on from the Fed chair. And I do remember, I didn't remember as much as Paul reminded me that I had been sharply critical of him, apparently, in the early 80s because of the high interest rates. And as I now think about it, I wasn't thinking a lot about national policy. I'd been working at the state legislative level. But I began to formulate then the view that I still have, and I have with regard to trade, which is when we are doing policies that are macroeconomically in the interest of the country as a whole, we need to pay attention to the differential impact that will have on the most vulnerable. And we shouldn't refuse to go ahead with things, but we should have redistributive policies in place. And David reminded me of this, is that my problem with the 17% interest rates, I think Paul got them up to break the back of the inflation, was precisely that it was occurring at a time when Ronald Reagan, the first thing that Reagan was able to do in 1981 was to pass what was called the Graham-Latta bill. Jack remembers that, when Tip was deeply engaged in fighting that. And it was put together very hastily to the point where the phone number for one of the staffers was actually on the bill. Tip asked if she had now become part of the law of America, had called so-and-so and gave her extension. But what troubled me was we were doing something that was in the interest of the nation's economy as a whole, simultaneously making it harder for those people who are going to bear the brunt. And I think I probably didn't articulate that well enough, and my complaint was not simply, the higher interest rates would have been okay if we were shredding the safety net at the same time as we were throwing more people into it. Now, that recession kept me alive politically, because in 1981, the Massachusetts legislature, which I had managed to offend in many ways, my Democratic colleagues, redistricted me and threw me into a district that I was sure I was going to lose against a Republican incumbent, Margaret Heckler. And I won only because of the recession and other things. But that was my first encounter with Paul. Then I did not have a lot to do. The second one, actually, I do remember, and I annoyed him, and I realized I was a little snarky. Paul was...
It's good to know you haven't changed.
Paul was always... Paul, you know, one of the things about Paul is that his reputation deserved, his integrity, his fairness. He's never going to get any peace because people are always going to need him when there's trouble. So he was head of the committee to arbitrate this very difficult issue of how you dealt with the accounts, insurance and bank accounts that had gone to Switzerland that belonged to Jews who had been either killed in the Holocaust or expropriated. And Paul was head, and we had legislation dealing with it. Stu Eisenstadt was working on that. And Paul was appointed head of the Committee of Eminent Persons. And I have to say that I thought that was pretty funny. A Committee of Eminent Persons. And I guess when I was questioning him, I could not sort of stifle my intrigue in the fact that he was the head of the Committee of Eminent Persons. And I guess I may have said it once too often. He said, well, I did not name, that's not my title. I didn't pick that, so I backed down. But then, of course, I got to know him during the financial crisis, and he was extraordinary. In addition to the Volcker rule and everything, he was the validator for me for moderate Democrats. We did some fairly drastic things in that financial reform bill. Some of my friends on the left thought it was terrible until Donald Trump came along, and now they have seen virtue in it because it's, you know, they see what the alternatives are. But as we were negotiating some very difficult issues beginning in January of 2009, Paul's participation, his public statements, my favorite was that when we talked about securitization and the derivatives and CDOs and CDO squares, and Paul said that he thought the only really important value-adding financial innovation in the past 20 years had been the ATM. But he validated for me. We needed to hold the Democrats. The Republicans at that point, and, you know, we should, and I will repeat what I said before, our problem today is 2007, 2008, there was a terrible crisis in this country, and the Democrats went to the economy's rescue. We controlled Congress at the time, and if you want to know about when was bipartisanship, read Ben Bernanke's book, Sheila Baer's book, Hank Paulson's book, the three major Bush appointees, how much the Democrats saved them from Republican obstructionism, particularly in the House. I mean, what bipartisanship died in January of 2009 when Barack Obama took over and Mitch McConnell declared war on him. And I will just look at the contrast between the two. But what it meant was that we had to pass this with all Democrats in 2009. And obviously there were some moderate Democrats who were worried about this. They were hearing from the financial institution. And Paul was the validator. He persuaded people, not simply by who he is, but by what he said. And then, by the way, you know, Paul actually, I was feeling a little bit ignored by the Obama administration, which happens. You know, you're in power and you're doing everything. And then towards the end of the year, there was the fear that, well, it could go to the Senate and maybe it'll flag. And the president realized he needed Paul, and that's when the Volcker rule came. People had asked me where the Volcker rule came from, and I said, on high, in 2 words, in 2 sentences. But he was, beyond the specifics of the Volcker rule, we would not have gotten as good a bill as I think we got if he was not there, both with his specific advice and because of his reputation as a solid guy who understood the finance community. That's the last point I would make, is that, you know, the refuge of people in any line of work against regulation is to say, you don't understand their business. Well, what do you guys know? You don't know anything. Well, nobody could claim that they knew more about how the financial system worked than Paul. And that was an enormous asset.
So I know he's listening and would be angry that we're spending our time talking about him.
Well, he's an eminent person, remember.
He is. He's
Chairman of the committee.
He's chairman of the eminent people.
Right.
So, but what I do want to do now, and first I want to alert the audience that I'm going to ask one more question, and then I want to give you all a chance. So be ready. But My one question before we turn to the audience, and I see Bill's ready already, so we'll come to you, Bill, as soon as I get this one out. But I'm eager for you all to tell us two things. One is, what was maybe the most challenging circumstance you faced in public service? And what was, in terms of an issue or a situation, and what was the personal moment of greatest satisfaction for you in public service? Secretary Lew?
I'm always bad at the most questions because
Yeah.
there's so many
They're hard.
candidates to choose from. I mean, when I look back over the decades of things I worked on, what I always come back to and have the most pride in is Social Security reform in 1983. It went from being the third rail of American politics to something where there was a compromise, and it has, for 43 years, made the most important social program we have something people could rely on. You know, when I think back about how that happened, you know, it actually informs some of today's, you know, kind of politics. You know, David pointed to the interest rates as the reason that the 82 elections didn't go well. I actually think it was a Social Security proposal that came out of HHS, where 1982 was a fight over who do you trust to take care of Social Security. And the issue could have been left in a place that was so toxic that neither side had anything they could come back to. But on both sides, there were people who were talking to President Reagan, talking to Speaker O'Neill, saying you got to leave some places to come to. There were people like, you know, Bob Ball and Alan Greenspan who were in the mix, running back and forth, talking to all sides. And you had two leaders who were willing to say, I'm going to go back to my side and sell them something that they wouldn't have wanted as their first choice. And because of it, we left the country a better place. I could repeat that model on a lot of other things, but for me, maybe it's because it was early, maybe because it was on an issue I care deeply about. It comes to mind as the example I go back to. We did the balanced budget agreement. We've done a lot of important things that I've been part of, but that has a special character to it. And for me, the hardest, there are a lot of hard issues, but in some ways, for me, the hardest issue was welfare reform in 1996. And not probably for the reason that most people would think of. It was debatable whether or not welfare would be better as a state program than a federal program. My inclination was it was better as a federal program, but I could accept the argument that we're trying something that the president believed in, that, you know, many people said would be better. What I found to be just beyond anything I could justify was the fact that to pay for grants to the states, benefits for immigrants were being cut. And they hadn't been the cause of the welfare problem. They'd been paying in to earn benefits. Taking it away was just mean-spirited. And that, to me, was, again, because it's an issue I care passionately about, something that was, I didn't know if I could defend being for it. And I remember conversations I had with President Clinton at the time, where he didn't disagree on the issue of the provisions to cut immigrants. And what he said to me was, you know, we're never going to get another chance at doing welfare reform. We'll get a chance to fix these things. And if you're sitting there at the table, it could be at the top of your list. And I spent a lot of the next 3 years restoring those benefits for immigrants because I put it at the top of my list in budget negotiations year after year after year. Now, I had to spend a lot of political capital to do that. And I will add that those things are now in danger because of things that are being proposed. But for me, that was a moment of personal dilemma and crisis. Other issues have been hard, but that's one I come back to at the top of the list.
David, 4 different administrations inside in the White House.
I know, it sounds great, but actually, I started with Watergate, and I wound up with Whitewater. Yeah. So it was a hell of a run, yeah. There's no question that the toughest period came during the Watergate crisis. And I learned then that, in fact, the system of checks and balances as envisioned by Madison worked better than anyone could have imagined, and I think they're at work again today. I was in a situation where I was young, and we were being told by our bosses that all the lying was being done by the Washington Post, what you might have called fake news in those days. And everybody inside was innocent and so forth and so on. And what I discovered, I knew Bob Woodward, and we had gone to college together. And what I discovered, of course, was just the opposite. And I had a team. I was running a speech writing and research team. It was about 50 people, and there were a lot of questions about should you stay or should you leave. And for a lot of us, it was the cover-up worked better inside the White House than anywhere else, because these were people you met every day, you saw, and they were telling you, no, I'm innocent. And I did some of the reports on the marginal issues, such as improvements to San Clemente or his tax returns. And he wasn't, there were infractions, but they weren't like, things that you were going to be impeached over. And so when it all came out, of course, it was very difficult for a lot. Those of us who worked inside, I think we mostly thought that it was like playing for the Chicago Black Sox, the team that threw the World Series back in the 1920s, and they were never heard from again in baseball. Scott Fitzgerald wrote that there are no second chances in American life. And fortunately, I discovered after that wasn't true. It's a much more forgiving society, and the people who had come through and were relatively clean, went on to good careers, and things worked out pretty well. I had friends, though, who went to jail, and I think that's because they were manipulated by people who were older, who told them this is the way you do it, and this is what you have to do to be a real man, or whatever it might be. And to see people whose lives were crushed was also very, very difficult. It's hard to say what the high point would be. I did feel fortunate to work for Bill Clinton in the early days. I came in about 6 months in, and he was floundering, and I was part of an effort to help him get back on his feet. And he mostly did it himself. Our thesis was, let Clinton be Clinton. He's lost his self-confidence. He's been banged up. He didn't know Washington. It was a much harder leap than he expected. Very hard on Hillary. And but he gradually got himself back on his feet, and I think he went on to become a much more successful president. And I was proud to be part of that. But I have to tell you, going back to one of the things that I think is difficult in federal service is that you're increasingly in Washington removed from the people you're trying to help or you're trying to do something good for in terms of policy. And one of the good things about working in local government or city or state is that you actually can talk to people who are being affected by what you're doing, and you can actually see the difference in lives. And that is, sometimes I once told Mayor Daley, he took me out on a one-day tour of the city of Chicago, and we went out on a boat and looked at all the things he'd done and walked the streets. I said, you got the best political job in America. You're doing big things, it's important, and you can see it. You can feel it, and you can talk to the people. And it gave him so much satisfaction. And I think that we have to find ways to make public service more connected. So if you've got problems in West Virginia, or you've got problems in South Bronx, you really get a chance to go in. I once went to the South Bronx with Bill Bradley years ago, and we were doing some Aspen things together, and we went into South Side Chicago, and we went into southern LA, and we went down in the Rio Grande area. And I learned one hell of a lot just by going out and seeing things. It made a major difference in my life.
Congressman?
First, I just want to, because this is my overriding theme about public policy, when Jack said it was not the high interest rates, but Social Security, I think it was both. The high interest rates, nobody went out, well, maybe, I don't know, Bill Loach can tell us whether anybody in his circle said, 17% I'm voting no or I'm voting yes, but the actual interest rate number did not resonate. But the recession it caused did hurt. But I think the problem was, but Social Security is making people nervous. It is the combination of public policies that produce distress in some segments of the population and don't alleviate it. That is problematic. It was a recession coming at the same time that we were cutting the safety net. Unemployment's going up when unemployment compensation is going down. And that's, I think, the fundamental reason we're in the bind we were in today, because people pursued global economic policies that were good for the GDP, but not so good for individuals. As to the personal thing, you know, it's an easy question for me because of my unique circumstance. Obviously, for me, the hardest part of public life was being gay. And in fact, it's really relevant to today. The theme of my memoir was that when I first thought I'd like to go into politics, I realized that because I'm gay, I would never be able to do that as an elected official, and maybe even not in a major appointed way, because I was a member of the most unpopular group in America. And to be in government, this is in the 50s and the 60s, you got to be popular. This was Dwight Eisenhower, John Kennedy. This was for people of respect. And then, as I made the theme of my book, over the next, well, from the 50s, the next 60 years, I started out being gay very unpopular in his government. As the time went by, being gay became less and less unpopular, and government became more and more popular. So that by the time I retired, I mean this quite literally, in 2012, being gay was much more socially acceptable than being a congressman. And, when I am told by pollsters, I didn't poll it, that the most popular thing that people would say about me when I retired was that I had married Jim while I was still in office. It ranked ahead of the Dodd-Frank bill. I told Chris that working with him didn't work out nearly as well for me as working with Jim. And so the high point then was when I finally decided in 1987 that I would be honest about being gay, and volunteered that in the Boston Globe. You know, it was a little dance there, because then, still now, the media position is that you do not out someone against his or her will unless he, and it's generally he, it's not the she, has been involved in some unpleasantness in which his sexual orientation is relevant, which meant that the only prominent people who were known to be gay were people who had done something bad, literally. And so I decided in '87 I wasn't going to wait. Later on, I did do something stupid, but in '87, I volunteered to come out, and so, you know, it was nothing bad connected. But that clearly, that made a big difference. But it has given me a perspective on the unpopularity of government, seriously, because I was convinced I could never do anything political, and I realized at some point that no, being gay is now, as I said, has sort of moved ahead of being in the government and acceptability.
Okay, well, let's take some time to see what questions you might have. Bill Rhodes had his hand up first, and then we've got one up in the back. Please use the microphone so that Mr. Volcker can hear.
Thank you, Tom, and thank the three panelists for their reminiscences of Paul Volcker, who's such a great man and played such a great role in our modern economic history. But I'd like to mention something that often is not mentioned. It wasn't in the clips, but one of the greatest services he did to the United States and for the world. And you have to go back to 1982 and the great period of recycling to the emerging markets and the Mexico debt crisis. This was a crisis that could have become the second Great Depression if Paul hadn't stepped in, because most of the American banks were undercapitalized, most of the European banks were undercapitalized, and so were the Japanese banks. And it all lent very heavily to Latin America and to the emerging markets, countries like the Philippines, Africa, and a number of countries in East and Central Europe. And if he hadn't stepped in at that moment, with the help of Jacques de la Rosière at the International Monetary Fund, we definitely would have gone into a Great Depression. And people tend to forget that. But there are several people in the room. Sam Cross, who worked with him, was a point person at the New York Fed on this, where we had these meetings. And we have Enid Bradfield, the widow of Mike Bradfield, who was the chief legal counsel of Paul at that time, who played such an important role in working through this crisis, which lasted almost a decade. But if it hadn't been stopped at that point, I remember at the IMF World Bank meetings in Toronto, They were talking about rearranging the deck chairs in the Titanic. That's how serious it was. And for all the great things Paul has done, you've talked about, including killing the dragon inflation and all the other things he's done, Volcker rule and everything else, we need to remember that moment in time when basically he saved us from the second Great Depression in the century. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Question up in the back, I think. Over here.
Good afternoon. Thank you all present here today for your individual commitments to public service. I really appreciate that. I'm simultaneously honored by being invited to this symposium today and humbled by the experience and wisdom that surrounds me here today. There are also a number of tomorrow's leaders in the audience, and it's for those who I ask this question. I heard a lot of discussion today about dynamic governance and the shared responsibilities of the citizens and leaders. And I often feel that I'm in a culture where, contrary to the spirit of studying history for the sake of avoiding repeating it, that we often embrace tradition in maybe a prideful way where it almost becomes hubris to repeat governance behaviors that we have in the past that haven't been necessarily particularly successful. And I was wondering if you have any advice for tomorrow's leaders with regard to how to confront difficult, maybe impediments to dynamic governance, change, how to confront the need to change when the culture is opposed to making changes.
Secretary Wood.
I think that we have a crisis in leadership today that's been a long time in the making, but it's gotten to a point where it is making government dysfunctional. Leaders are not willing to take on even their issues that they believe in if they think it's going to undermine the ability to maintain their position. And at some point, leaders have to decide the position is not worth taking positions that you don't believe in and not moving the country in the right direction. And that means maybe there will be a challenge. My experience working for presidents and for a speaker who was willing to go back and tell people on their own side that you had to compromise, you had to do something that wasn't your first choice, was it didn't cost them their jobs. I think that there's kind of this notion that by digging in your heels and empowering a small but powerful part of one side and stopping the process, that you're somehow creating the ability to maintain power and B, accomplish goals. What we've achieved is gridlock. What we've achieved is something that's destroyed confidence in government. And I kind of agree with Barney that it was a pendulum where sometimes we did better and sometimes we did worse. But until 2009, for all of the years that I was in government, that pendulum came back to working together. And since 2009, it has been only the smallest episodes and not on things of substantial importance. And we're seeing it again now. We're seeing, when we did tax reform in 1986, we did it on a bipartisan basis. We did it with Democrats and Republicans. Bill Bradley was one of the leaders, going shoulder to shoulder against special interests to say we have to do hard things to lower tax rates. What we're seeing now is on a partisan basis, that's really hard. You can't take on all the special interests. And I think what we're going to get as a result is something that creates a monster of a problem for our children and grandchildren by taking on enormous debt to cut taxes in a way that isn't going to produce the results we need. But it comes back to leadership. And I'd say to young people, be different. Go back and learn from history about leaders who didn't feel that they had to villainize the people on the other side. They could be friends and opponents at the same time. And when the time came to it, they could work together and compromise. Because we're going to be in pretty tough shape if we don't get back to that.
Yeah, I guess Jack and I agree on almost everything, but I disagree here for the same things I voiced. It's time to stop talking about this in neutral terms. What happened was, in 2009, an extreme right-wing group took over the Republican Party that does not believe in governance, and that's what we are now suffering from. Under George W. Bush, there was a great deal of bipartisanship. He got Part D Medicaid, although that was more partisan. He got No Child Left Behind. Sadly, I wish it wasn't the case. He had bipartisan support to go to war in Iraq, virtually unanimous support for war in Afghanistan. And then in 2007, when the Democrats take over the House, you had 2 years of among the best bipartisan cooperation in American history, because as the economy was tumbling, with an election approaching, Harry Reid and Nancy Pelosi, both, I think, fairly high on the scale of partisans in general, said, we're going to do what we can to save the economy. I think with the current Republicans, by the way, they would say, oh, good, let it go sour. It was in September of 2008, the most fraught period in American political calendar, just before a presidential election, that we went to work with them on the TARP, giving money to the banks, which I believe will go down in history as the single, combined, most unpopular, successful thing the federal government ever did. But but what happened then was, in 2009, again, you can't do this in some neutral, sort of clinical way. What then happens is, in 2009 and 2010, the Republican Party moves to the right. And Bob Bennett is not allowed to run for re-election in Utah. And Mike Castle loses in the primary. And what happens then is Kay Bailey Hutchinson, who is a very respected figure, loses to Rick Perry to be governor of Texas. And it's what people did talk about before. Tom Davis talked about it, the primaries. And it is true that the Democrats have moved somewhat to the left as the Republicans moved to the right, but not as much procedurally. Basically, the Republican Party became shutting down the government. There is a refusal, and it's not and by the way, Jack, the only thing I would differ with is this: it's not that they won't take leadership. Some of them will. It's an ideology more than an unwillingness to take leadership. I got to be honest with you, in terms of leadership, the Republican Party today in the U.S. House of Representatives is asking members from New Jersey and California, Tom Davis said Virginia, New York, to vote against their own constituents' direct interests more broadly than I've ever seen with this state and local tax deduction. But I think that is the issue. Now, I have some hope because, but it's connected to this seminar. I'm not just making a political point. Because what happened was you had, for the first time, people who don't believe in government. It was not an argument. I mean, Gerald Ford believed in government. Richard Nixon very much believed in government. You now have this crowd, even the Reagan people believed in government, how you did it. You have people now who literally do not believe in government and think that no government is better in many cases. And what makes me feel good now, and I think yesterday validated it some, I think essentially the bad results that President Trump and the Republicans are having is making people think better about government. I mean, just frankly, I think a large percentage of the American public had come to believe that government sucks. And now, as they are watching what's going on, more and more of them are coming to believe that no government sucks worse than government. And so that things that we did that were once, the health care bill is popular for the first time. Other things are becoming popular for the first time. And that's the fight we're in now. And that's why it is very important for those of us who believe that. And I want my friends on the left not to fall into the temptation of being for specific programs as if they were exceptions. The other thing is, and this is for part of the problem, is that the left joined in by demonizing government. And that's a very short, thing. And finally, it's the media, which, and I don't know how you get around that. I do not myself watch Facebook and stuff. I mean, I don't care where anybody has lunch except me. But I do know this, whether it's YouTube or anything else, no clip of a United States senator telling a cabinet secretary that she did a very good job has ever gone viral. The internet is the medium for abuse and ranting and nastiness. And I don't know what you do about that, but I do think that people are starting to react back. But this is not some neutral thing. This is the political success tied again, it seems to me, to a public policy mistake of thinking about what's in the general interest without realizing what specific effects it has on various groups in the population.
So we're about out of time, and I want to let David Gergen talk for a minute about advice to young people, and what, because he does a lot of this.
Young people, go out and vote. And vote for primaries. Quick, can I do, here's my advice for them. Look at history. There was a great deal of anger in 2009 about the failure to penalize the banks, and people thought it was very unfair. So two groups sprung up, very angry, one on the right, one on the left. You had the Tea Party and you had Occupy. And they started out both very energetic. And the Tea Party people took over the Republican Party. They voted, they went out in primaries, and they lobbied. Occupy smoked dope and had drum circles. And that we're now living with the political result.
All right, David.
Yeah, listen, my argument to young people is really a generational argument. I am very skeptical whether the current generation in power is capable and has the will to overcome the kind of gridlock we're in now and the poisonous kind of politics we're in now. I think this is a generation that, by and large, is the baby boom generation, and we were coddled too much when we were young, and we went through a very divisive war in Vietnam that just split our generation down the middle, and we've got we went to war with each other with social values and that sort of thing in the 60s and 70s. I think we've never quite recovered from it as a generation that's in power now. However, I think there are increasing signs all around the world that it's time for a new generation to step forward. We're seeing new leadership with new hope in country after country. I think it's going to come to the United States soon. I hope sooner rather than later. But if you look at Canada with Trudeau, you look at Argentina with Macri, you look at Macron in France, not all these people are perfect. The 32-year-old that comes out of Austria is certainly not an ideal, right? And we'll have to wait and see in Saudi Arabia what's going to come of this new leader. He's 32 years old, or very young, and he's trying to do almost the impossible overnight, but he's wound up jailing a lot of people and crushing their civil liberties. So, it's a very mixed bag so far. But look at something like Trudeau and Canada. He's made Canada and I think he's not alone in this. This has happened over time. It's one of the best governed countries in the world right now. And they came through the recession very well because they had sensible regulation, and they knew enough to be a little cautious. But he's come in now, and he's half his cabinet women, and the guy's has told his staff, we ought to be thinking about this right here. He will not, Trudeau will not go into a public panel unless it's half women. And he's really crusading for changes like that. He's been good on immigrants. That's good too. At least half. I have no problem with that. It makes up for a lot of past sins. But he's brought fresh hope to Canada, and it's a more exciting place. And I just think, and what is encouraging to me now, and I think Tuesday gave us a sense of that. You look at Virginia, and the biggest homophobe in the Virginia legislature, this old white guy, this old fart kind of guy, gets beaten by a 32-year-old transgender woman. That is progress. And we ought to see it that. But what we're seeing as we go toward 2018 is there are a lot of people coming out of the woodwork now want to run for Congress, want to make a difference. There are surges going on among women that are very encouraging. Emily's list has got, they got a bulging number of people who are coming forward and saying, I want to get in, I want to make a difference, I want to change the world. I happen to be very involved in trying to help veterans and encouraging veterans to run. There's an organization called New Politics. A young woman named Emily Cherniak, she's got 20 veterans now lined up to run for Congress. She's raising money. I've done some fundraisers for them, and they're on both sides of the aisle. And the notion is, if you fought under the same flag, you can work together in the House of Representatives. And there's a PAC, just super PAC, just got raised. Hold on one second. Just got raised. Money is being raised right now for more veterans. Over 100 veterans who are running now, who are post 9/11 veterans, who are now running for Congress next year. I find that very, very encouraging. A lot of them are in uphill races. Some are going to break through. But most importantly, this generation is starting to step up. It's starting to step up, and that is very encouraging.
I could not disagree more that the issue is generation. In the first place, I don't know how your theory that we all got spoiled by the baby boom, although I'm too old for it, but the others, how do you explain 2007 and 2008? when you had this great cooperation in the midst of a crisis. I think it's ideological.
Who the heck got us into it?
What?
It was a lot of the baby boom generation got us into the crisis.
Yes, and then got us out of it.
They bear responsibility for it.
Yes, they do, but that's not your point. Your point was that we can't, not that people made mistakes in ideology, but that people were so used to fighting, they can't get together. And by the way, in terms of your veterans, the leading veteran in Congress today, of course, young man, is Tom Cotton, who's a very able, very smart guy, and is deeply conservative. He's kind of a better behaved Trump in terms of where he is. Can I finish, David? You had a lot of time. This notion...
I'm going to ask you both to finish quickly because we got to...
This notion that it is generational and not ideological, you say you have people on both sides. I'll be interested to see how many of those Republican women are going to be for doing what I think is right in health care. I mean, I think that, and if you look at Congress today, the ideological cleavage greatly outweighs the generational cleavage, whether it's at the state and local level or at the national level. And I think, I don't know, you don't want to talk about the ideological issue. It's not a uniform baby boomer problem. And we were working together during much of the Bush administration. And then the right wing takes over the Republican Party, including a lot of younger people. And that's where things go wrong.
We could talk on for this for another hour or two. But, Barney, I do think there's some ideological difference. But you can't escape the fact that the government has not been working well for a long time.
Because of ideology, not because of generation.
It is, I would argue, the generational, within the generations, there are two different views of the world. There are two different views of what a great society should look like.
David, part of the problem with that is generations overlap.
Secretary Lew wants to say a word.
One last point.
Yeah.
It is a fiction that there was this generation and that generation. There is a continuity of overlaps. Generations do not exist separately, and I think it is a much overdone concept and does not statistically.
The last word to Secretary Lew.
I think if you look at the last 30 years, we've had the pendulum swing back and forth in American politics on partisanship, on working together, not working together, through the baby boom generation, beyond. The thing that I would say to young people is do not get so turned off by what you see in politics that you leave it to others. Because if you don't roll up your sleeves and get out there, it isn't going to work. And it's your responsibility to make it better. And you can make it better.
And that's something we all agree on. So let's thank this panel. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. I told you it'd be interesting. So thank you, the three of you, for your reflections and your thoughts. Let me ask you to give them all another round of applause. Before we depart to the cocktail hour, we have one last treat. We have several video tributes to Mr. Volcker from sitting United States senators, from Senator Elizabeth Warren, Senator Bob Corker, Senator Jeff Merkley, and Senator Mark Warner. They could not be with us personally, but wanted to send their greetings. Following these video tributes, we will hear from David Van Slyke, who is the Dean of the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University. The Maxwell School established the Paul Volcker Chair in Behavioral Economics in 2014, and additionally, the school holds an annual Paul Volcker Symposium and Lecture. Following David will be Paul Light, whose names you've heard many times today, who is a dear friend of Mr. Volcker and one of America's most thoughtful and prolific writers on topics ranging from how government should function to the role of contracting to the way Americans view their government. He will offer some thoughts about Mr. Volcker and his service to our nation. Following these remarks, I will come back for some brief closing thoughts and a message from Mr. Volcker, and then we'll bring the day to a conclusion with the reception. But for now, let's hear from some United States senators.
Hello. I would much rather be there in person for this special symposium honoring Paul's incredible legacy, but I'm glad at least to have this chance to join you by video. You know, there are few people who have had more impact on our modern financial system than Paul Volcker. I got to know Paul well during the financial crisis as we were fighting to push crucial reforms through Congress. And boy, it was a fight. Giant financial institutions had just gotten billions of dollars in taxpayer bailouts, but they were ready to fight regulations tooth and nail. I remember the day that it finally felt like we had won, July 21st, 2010. It was the signing ceremony for Dodd-Frank. And that morning in Washington, it was hot, it was steamy, it was sticky and nasty. You all know those Washington days. And for any event involving the president, you also know there's a point at which the doors are locked at the building, security's in place, and that's it. No one else gets in so that they can make sure security's okay. Well, I was scheduled to testify in the Senate that day, a couple of miles away from where the signing ceremony would be. So the minute I finished testifying, I dashed out of the hearing room, sprinted down the hall, and caught a ride, complete with a police escort, with Senator Dick Durbin. We came zooming in, tires squealing, and slipped through the door just as the Secret Service was locking down the building. And as I caught my breath, I realized that my assigned seat was tucked in right next to Paul. And there he was, the man who had saved our economic system back in the 80s and who had come back with the Volcker rule following the crash of 2008. It was the perfect place to celebrate a great victory for the American people. For more than 5 decades, Paul has commanded the attention of captains of industry. His words have moved markets, but he has never stopped speaking the truth, whatever the audience. At 90, some people would say enough, but not Paul. He has never stopped applying his brain and his persistence toward fighting for a more robust, efficient, and effective set of rules to keep the American economy safe. So, Paul, thank you for your decades of service to American families. I look forward to continuing our fight together to strengthen our markets and our economy.
Congratulations, Chairman Volcker, on 90 incredible years. You've served under multiple presidents, under both parties. You have served in times of challenge and in times of prosperity. You have done it with sincerity, good spirit, dedication, and patriotism. As a first-term senator serving on the Banking Committee at the height of the Great Recession, I was honored to work with you to help forge the Volcker Rule into legislation. This went a long ways toward shutting down the Wall Street casino and stabilizing our financial and banking system. Well done. Thank you for your leadership. And from you, I learned a lot about national economics and finances, but even more about courageous and determined public service. Thank you, and happy belated birthday. I hope you and everyone at the Volcker Alliance has a wonderful time at today's symposium.
Hello, I'm Bob Corker, and I'm sorry I cannot be with you in person, but I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you in this way. Chairman Volcker, thank you for your dedication to public service. You served nearly 30 years in the federal government and left an indelible mark. But you didn't stop there. You went on to create the Volcker Alliance, which brings together policymakers, scholars, and thought leaders to explore and discuss how we can create a more effective government at the federal, state, and local level. And whether it's strengthening professional education or researching government performance or improving the accountability of government, you have worked tirelessly to help our governing institutions adapt to changing times. Without a doubt, you've always pursued your interests with a full heart and a direct vision. I wish you the best and hope everyone enjoys today's event. And again, thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Senator Mark Warner from Virginia. I regret that I'm not able to join you today, but I didn't want to miss an opportunity to honor my friend Paul Volcker and commemorate his decades of public service. For nearly 30 years, Paul has made an impact in and outside of government. He's had a successful tenure, obviously, as we all know, as chairman of the Federal Reserve, serving 2 terms there and being appointed by 2 different presidents of 2 different political parties. We perhaps collaborated the most closely when Paul served as head of the private nonpartisan Commission on Public Service. Together, we pursued our shared goal of reforming the way government is organized so it's more efficient and responsive to taxpayers. But Paul's career in public service turned yet another page with his founding of the Volcker Alliance. In just 4 years, this organization has grown into an influential voice on smart government and data-driven policies. Without a doubt, Paul's work here with the Alliance continues to be truly important. So again, I send my best to all of you gathered here today. Happy belated birthday to you, Paul. I know that we're grateful for your many years of service, and I know there'll be many more years of service to come. Again, thanks so much.
Hi, I'm David Van Slyke from the Maxwell School, and it's just a real pleasure and honor to be here. Tom and the Volcker Alliance and Chairman Volcker, thank you so much. Chairman Volcker and I became acquainted in 1995 when I had to read a lot of his written material in my doctoral politics and administration class. I was an unconventional student to come into public administration, having worked in the private sector, a brief time in state government, and then the nonprofit sector. One of the things that I came to know about Chairman Volcker through his writings was how committed he was to this broad theme of public service. Imagine my delight many years later as a professor at the Maxwell School when someone said to me, the chairman has a half an hour in between his schedule. Would you be interested in meeting him? Now, I'm not one of those people that's taken selfies of themselves with famous people and rarely, if ever, posting them on Instagram. But I took a picture of the chairman and I with me sort of looking like this up at him. And it was amazing at how lucid his comments were about what was happening at the Maxwell School. And it was with deep appreciation that I received those comments. Then to have the great honor to become the dean, my very first visit was to New York City to see the chairman. And again, it was with deep admiration, but about something that I learned about him, that he and I share this great frugality. He says to me, he says, let's go have lunch. So I follow the chairman out, and if you've ever been to his office, it's right there near Rockefeller Center. We go to an office building, we go to a nondescript, non-labeled 3rd floor where there's a very small restaurant and a tiny deli. And I said to him, I said, Chairman, is this a place that you come often? And he says, of course, it's cheap. And it was great food. And it was, you know, when I was with my family in the city, I said to them, I said, I know just the place to take us for lunch, and it's affordable and good food. And they're like, I think you're making something up, Dad. I said, Chairman Volcker took me there. And that was it. They were like, all right, maybe this is okay. So I want to talk a little bit about just a few remarks about the chairman. I think one of the things that is so different about him is what an unabashed admirer and vocal champion he is of public administration. And he remains an advocate for capable public servants at every level of government, and those who work with governments across the sectors, and especially in a time in which public policy has become far more sexy and the discipline of economics pervades almost everything we do. the chairman is always offering a sobering assessment that first and foremost, public administration is where all the action happens. He's so clear and articulate in saying, you know, look, you can have the very best policy designs there are, but in fact, if you don't think about the tools of government, if you don't think about the breadth and complexity of how it's happening, and if you don't think about clients and beneficiaries, then the best intended policies are going to fall down. Because in fact, we're not going to have public administrators who are trained with a set of capabilities, who reflect a set of values, and who have a commitment and determination to move government forward at every level that they work at. And you know, I mean, it's just amazing because in a place where there are so many fads, in a place where public administration kind of waxes and wanes in terms of how people see it, is it really a discipline? Is it an art? Is it a science? Is it nothing at all? Is it simply bureaucratic? The chairman remains one of those individuals who I think really talks about it in a way that can make people excited. The second thing about the chairman that I've always appreciated is he is all about the long view. And 90 years is a long view. And Chairman, I wish you a great happy birthday on behalf of everyone from the Maxwell Advisory Board on which you serve and the Maxwell School. But in that long view, I think the second thing I've really come to appreciate in our multiple conversations is when he talks about trade-offs. He never talks about trade-offs in terms of optimality. He always talks about trade-offs as trade-offs between a series of really suboptimal choices. And what really grounds those suboptimal choices? It's a set of values. It's a set of principles. It's a set of first principles that you don't betray. You don't betray them based on election cycle. You don't betray them based on kind of where the current movement is. It's about coming back to what is it going to take to strengthen governance. And that's the second thing that I really appreciate about him. The third thing that I appreciate is, as many of you know who have interacted with him, he is constantly challenging the counterfactual. And it's not enough to get into an ideological conversation with him. And one of the great things about him is he is completely impatient with ideology. He is one of the people who I think understands theory and then understands the difference of theory when it comes to meet the reality of practice. And in that implementation environment, the thing that I've always appreciated about him is he's constantly talking about the need for government to be stronger. Now, he doesn't disagree that public service can happen anywhere, in the private sector, in the nonprofit sector, and government at every level. But I think he comes back to governance is stronger when, in fact, we're not simply contract managers checking a series of boxes, but if, in fact, we're going to engage the private sector and the nonprofit sector, that we ourselves have a critical understanding of what those skills are and how those values should be put into place. The frame in front of you, I think, really captures how we at the Maxwell School see the chairman. You can see behind him in one of the pictures, he's standing in front of the Athenian Oath, inscribed on the walls outside of the Maxwell Auditorium where presidents such as Harry Truman have given speeches. Chairman Volcker was there for the Volcker Lecture last year, and it was amazing to think of an individual, 90 years old, being swarmed by a series of students from all across the United States and from 50 countries around the world, because they knew his reputation. And as we heard on the panel just before us, he exemplifies this kind of eminent person, a person whose legitimacy and credibility is built on a lifetime of commitment to public service and not just any one act. So, Chairman, thank you very much for leaving what you found greater, better, and more beautiful than it was transmitted to you. Thank you for your commitment to public service, and happy birthday.
It's wonderful that David felt short around Paul Volcker, because I'm like this when I'm with Mr. Volcker. I don't have much to say, except I was thinking about all of this during this day, and I thought I'd say thanks to Mr. Volcker on behalf of all of us who've worked for him. Many of us have worked with him, but some of us in this room, Shelley, Hannah, many of us have been touched Gorov, I don't know whether Bill's still here. We all worked for him, and all of the Volcker Alliance people here, Emily, all of the people who brought this thing to fruition, and now you're in charge. And it's been a pleasure working with him. He's a great boss. He's an inspiring boss. He doesn't ask too much of us except everything. And I've enjoyed it, and I've been mentored by some terrific people over the years, and I'm blessed, I said in that little clip, I'm blessed to have come into his orbit, and I'm grateful for his attention and interest. I also wrote for him. Now that's a test, and he is a tough editor. I was going back over the past reports that Mr. Volcker has credentialed and embraced, the commission reports. It's been 30 years to this week, I believe, that the first Volcker Commission met at Princeton to talk about the state of the public service, 30 years ago. It was 15 years, pretty much, after that first commission that we got together, Hannah, and started to work on the second commission. It's 90 years, of course, since Mr. Volcker's entrance into this world, and it's been a lovely encounter filled with strength and humor. He's a funny guy. He's not hilarious in the sense of a joke teller, but his stories never fail. Am I right? I just wanted to say just a couple of things. I mean, I view him as a mentor, as having the mind of a problem solver. He may be an economist. He never pulls that card, but he's a problem solver. He's a practical thinking person. He has the heart of an advocate from my perspective. He's willing to say it directly and roughly and truthfully, and he can rub people the wrong way. He once said to me after the week in which he challenged the economics profession, or the banking industry, to name one innovation beyond the ATM that's made a difference in this world, and he and I were talking about some issue, and he turned to me and he said, "You kind of rub people the wrong way." And I'm shocked at that kind of a comment about me. And I said, "You mean you, the author of the ATM challenge?" And he's been wonderful in that regard in teaching all of us when to stand and how hard to stand. And he's got a grace that I certainly lack, but one that I admire so much. He never wavered over these years. My goodness, 30 years on this issue, you know, stuck with it, kept talking about it. You couldn't, you know, push him away from it. He just stuck with it, and he's still on it. The one thing I will tell you is that he has the pen of a tireless editor. Shelley, you know it. Hannah, you know it. I know it. There's never anything I gave to him that he couldn't rewrite. And I got tired of giving him stuff because I knew he was going to rewrite. There are three things you should know about him as an editor. He loves the Courier typeface. Now, there aren't that many people left who like Courier. I'm just saying. Arial's the fashion. Times New Roman is my preference. He'll edit and edit and edit. And his scribbles, his writing on these documents, I had small groups of students that I'd call on to help us interpret what this particular scribble meant. Anka, the lovely partner, Mr. Volcker's partner, she sometimes would give up. The important thing is that every edit he made was pretty much the best edit that could be made. You go back to it and you say, wow, this is a gifted writer. That's his real passion, John. You've been in his circle. You've seen all of this. I went back to the Volcker report from 1989. I was writing something. And I was looking at it and I was saying, gosh, that's a really good opening paragraph. Whew, that's really good. I was really on that day. And I have the original drafts, and it wasn't me. It was him. Quiet crisis? That's mine. Wait a second, it was his, you know. He came up with that idea, and it took our dear friends at GAO until 2001 to say, you know, there's a quiet crisis going on here in strategic human capital management. They knew it, and they helped in all of that. I'm just saying, he's a gift to work for. He's an inspiring individual, a committed public servant. But for all of us who've worked with him, and all of us who've worked for him, and I would count a lot of us in this room as in that category, he's been a joy. So I'm looking right at you, Mr. Volcker. Thanks a lot. Give me a call, and we'll talk about rubbing people the wrong way. All my best to you. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you both. Those were terrific. I don't know which message to read from him because I keep getting them. Every 2 seconds I get another one from him. But as we conclude our day together, I hope that you found the conversations to be engaging and provocative, even a little spirited toward the end. It's clear that we have entered a new governance era. Our nation has considerable work to do to ensure that we continue to deliver on the promise of effective government. We must be sure that our government is prepared for the data and technology revolution and is well positioned to respond to changes in our economic system. We need to help bring innovation and intergovernmental cooperation to long-term needs such as infrastructure and regulation, while doing all we can to ensure, and this is the most important to Mr. Volcker, that the best and brightest Americans can be called to and feel valued in a career in the public service. I leave today myself reminded that we are blessed with men and women of extraordinary capacity and character, who have in the past and will carry forward this nation's legacy of public endeavors. You heard the name earlier today, Mike Bradfield, who was general counsel to Mr. Volcker at the Fed. His wife is here. Mr. Volcker still misses Mike a great deal. He passed not too long ago. And people like Mike Bradfield and Paul Volcker are the kinds of public servants that we need. There's serious and significant work to be done, and the Volcker Alliance stands ready to do our part to join with all of you to meet the challenges ahead. Finally, I want to express my gratitude to the many people who made today's events possible, to all of our speakers, panelists, and tribute givers for your participation and insights that helped drive our conversation today, to Andy Streitfeld for the amazing clips of Volcker Saving America from the Brink documentary, as well as his unbelievably quick action in getting to New York to have Mr. Volcker record a message, then edit it and get it to us here. To all in government, academia, and NGOs who have been partners to the Volcker Alliance's work during its early years, I hope to continue and deepen our collaboration in the years ahead. Indeed, the need looms large as ever before. To the staff of the Volcker Alliance who bring our vision to life and who have put together this enormous event, I express particular thanks. I want to thank Melanie Martha, who is Mr. Volcker's tireless assistant, who is by his side now in New York, being sure that the live stream is working, and who helped produce the video. We miss her here, but we're delighted that she's there and able to send constant messages from the chairman. To the board of directors of the Volcker Alliance, many of whom are here today for helping us chart our course and lending your expertise and wisdom to our work, to Anka Volcker and the rest of the Volcker family who have been instrumental in the success of the Alliance. And finally, on behalf of everyone here, to Paul. Mr. Volcker, I know you're watching. Your life of service has been a model to which the rest of us can aspire. And your tireless work on behalf of our nation will continue to illuminate a path forward for many years to come. I'm honored to be associated with this organization which bears your name and have been humbled to work with you and learn from you. I look forward to continuing to do so for years to come. Now, as I conclude, here's the latest message. Much appreciation for your articulate reexamination of the public service. We will remain on the job. Many thanks to all personally and to the Alliance. With that, I welcome you to join us in the atrium for a cocktail reception to toast not only the past, but a bright future. Thank you.